Welcome to the Rosenbach Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ames, Associate Curator of the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. This is Season 2, History Behind the Scenes, in which we explore the Rosenbach's remarkable historical collections, travel behind the scenes into the work of the institution to preserve its treasures, and engage in critical conversations about the place of rare books, libraries, and museums in modern-day American civic life. In previous episodes of Season 2, my colleagues and I have introduced you to the Rosenbach's American history collections through our Rosenbach Test Kitchen competition, in which we prepared recipes inspired by historic menus and letters that we discovered in our collection. Now it's time to get some perspective on how research about food and dining habits fits into American history, and how collections of rare books, printed materials, manuscripts, and art, like those housed at the Rosenbach, help historians and the public understand our complicated, shared past. My guest today is the best person I can possibly imagine to help us situate our Rosenbach Test Kitchen experience of the past 3 episodes into a bigger perspective about researching and writing American history. Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson is professor and chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. She is an affiliate faculty member in Theater, Dance, and Performing Studies, the Departments of African American Studies, Anthropology, the Harriet Tubman Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity. Dr. Williams-Forson is the author of Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, published by UNC Press in 2022. Taking Food Public, Redefining Food in a Changing World, a collection of essays published by Routledge in 2013, and the award-winning Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power, published by UNC Press in 2006. She is known nationally and internationally for her pioneering work in building the scholarly subfield of Black food studies, and has published numerous articles on this aspect of the material lives of African Americans in the United States from the late 19th century to the present. This includes topics like Black women, food and power, food and literature, food and sustainability, race, food and design thinking, eating and workplace cultures, as well as the historical legacy of race and gender misrepresentation. Professor Williams-Forson, thank you so much for joining me on the Rosenbach Podcast.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
Why is the history of food important, and how do scholars study it?
The history of food is very important because food helps us to not only understand geography, cultural traditions, cultural continuity, but also just to understand the world around us because, of course, food is everywhere. And we all eat. And for that reason, oftentimes food is not considered, or sometimes is not considered as serious a course of study. But it absolutely is. For example, you can, from studying a single food object, trace, as I did in my first book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, I traced the relationship of African American people in America to the engagement with chickens, both agriculturally and then in the written record from an economic standpoint as traders, hucksters, peddlers during enslavement, around agricultural ways and means as market women and men, into the 21st century in popular culture, in visual culture, so that when we see, for example, an object of food appear, an apple, say, or a piece of watermelon, or a fruit basket, or whatever the case may be, or someone serving food to someone else, we can ask questions of why the particular artist or the particular author felt the need to include this food item. Is it random? Does it have meaning? And oftentimes it has a very particular meaning, and those meanings are not necessarily visible to the naked eye. And so it requires some unpacking and some thinking through, and maybe even some historical research to really get at what it is that the author is trying to do. So food really does have a lot of different meanings to our lives beyond eating and satiation.
As you know, this season of the podcast is devoted to showcasing the Rosenbach's American history collections and highlighting the behind-the-scenes work of how we care for and use those collections. I'd like to ask you to take us behind the scenes into how an historian does her research. How do you come up with a research idea, identify source materials relevant to it, and use items like rare books, manuscripts, and artifacts to explore the topic? How do you synthesize your findings and then share your ideas with the world?
Wow, that's a big question. So I never initially considered myself a historian. After my first book, had often been referred to as a culinary historian, and I guess that is the case. So I'm going to talk through this process again using references to my first book, because that was where I learned in detail the research process and had to implement it. Building houses out of chicken legs was my doctoral thesis. And so one of the things that I did initially, I was working for a colleague who at the time was a professor, and she had me doing research on Jewish foodways, peddlers, and the like. And this was really fascinating stuff for me. And I had never heard of the term foodways. And so what I did was I asked myself whether or not Black people had this thing called foodways. And so back then there was no Google, right? It was just the internet. And so I went on the internet and I typed in Black people or African Americans in foodways. And what came back were a number of different cookbooks. And so that was my starting point, actually, was the cookbook. And as I looked and checked out those cookbooks in the library, I began to see repetition in them, not so much of how the food was cooked, but the variety of ingredients and the types of foods. And so from that, I said, oh, wow, okay. So I know kind of what Black people eat, not just because I'm Black, but I'm also doing this research. But the question then becomes why? Why is it these particular foods that are associated? And so what I ended up doing was to do this work where you pull the thread, right? And so what I did then is I started buying off of eBay the variety of images that emerge when I would type in Black people and chicken. So now I'm looking at the image and I'm saying, okay, what is consistent here? And so what that does is that takes you into a number of different archives. So for example, at the Rosenbach, I might say, there's this particular article or image or what have you in Philadelphia. Let me contact one or two repositories there, the Rosenbach, the Library Company of Philadelphia, whatever the case may be, Library of Virginia. And I would contact a reference librarian and I would say, can you help me find more information on X? And it becomes very interesting because I have often been told, well, we don't have anything in our collections pertaining to that. Perfect example was some work I did at the Winterthur Museum and Library many years ago when I was a graduate student. I was looking for African Americans and food and couldn't find it, right? And they said, we're not sure that you're going to find anything here. But they accepted me as a fellow anyway. Well, as it turns out, I had to change the terminology. I had to look for domestics or servants or things of that nature. When I went to the Alderman Library at the University of Virginia, I had to do a similar kind of thing. And this was about 20 years ago. And so the terms nowadays, in some instances, have changed. But I had to go and sort of be creative and look far and wide. And nowadays, with the internet being what it is, you can do a lot of this work right from your computer, right? But these are important sources because they're first person accounts of issues and information that happened as it occurred. And you can't get any closer to the actual event than those first person accounts from the time period.
I'm curious a bit about your writing process and sort of as you're gathering these materials with this first book project, which was your dissertation, did you find that you sort of gathered all of the material first, all of your primary source research at once, and then sort of cloistered yourself away to turn it into a narrative to create your written document? Or was it more of an iterative process where you maybe did a small amount of the research, wrote it up, realized the questions you still had, got back in touch, made a second trip? What was that process like for you? And did you find yourself sort of frequently returning to the same repositories again and again?
Good question. Yes, it's absolutely iterative. Absolutely. So for me, I started out being very curious about Black people's relationships in popular culture in association with chicken, right? There were a series of events that happened around the time that I was trying to narrow my topic and determine what it is about Black people's food that I was going to write about. And as it turned out, chicken was the issue that rose to the top at that time. It was the turn of the 20th century. And there were things taking place in the media. And I was like, wow, Black folks are still kind of being associated with the stereotype of chicken. So I started out in my research process looking for those stereotypes. Even though I said that I had gotten this information from my professor at the time around Foodways, that's how I got started in Foodways. But to narrow things down to chicken, it was again a process because I had absolutely no idea what particular food I would be writing about. And so once that happened, that being once I said, let me see more about these Black people and chicken thing. What's going on here? I went back to the internet, and when I put in African Americans and chicken, I started getting sheet music and greeting cards and pictures and stereo views. So, and they were all on eBay. And so I would purchase those that I could afford because I was a grad student. I would purchase what I could. And then I was just in a frenzy at one point because I had hit upon this cache of images and I was like, wow, let me see what's going on here. Right. When I amassed these images, I began to see patterns. Right. And so how do you analyze the patterns? Well, that's when you go back to the internet and you're like, okay, what am I seeing? How do I understand historical photographs? How do I understand historical documents? And so that's a stage. And so for me, I started writing the findings initially. And then, quite frankly, I got to a point where I felt demoralized. This will happen. You either get bored, you get demoralized, any of those emotions can come about. I started getting demoralized because I said, okay, I can't continue to write anymore about how African American people have been maligned and criticized and made fun of in these visual imageries. So I was sitting one day and I just started going through some folders that I had. And in one of the folders, I found an image or an article announcing a fried chicken festival and it was a piece that had been sent to me by a dear colleague. And as I looked at the picture more and more, because at this point I was adept at looking at historical photographs, I thought to myself, this is not a reenactment. This is an actual photograph from a time period. So here again, you pull the thread. I went into the article and I saw the organization that had put on this festival. I made a call to them. They said, yeah, the festival has come and gone. And I said, well, where can I find more of these photographs? And they're like, you're welcome to come down and take a look at what we have. It's only a room, but that's our African American Historical Society. And so I did that. And when I went down, I found a news interview that had been given. So now we're at 3 different types of sources. We're at visual sources, we're at news sources, and then we're at interviews. And so taken together, I began to get a different sense of what it was I wanted to write about, right? And so the reason this becomes iterative is my entire project shifted in that moment when I traveled at the ninth hour in my doctoral thesis, at a time when all of my research should have been done. I traveled to a distant place and I said, hey, I'm not willing to start again, but I have to just figure out what this is because I really like this image. And so, as it turns out, I stumbled upon an entrepreneurial venture of 3 generations of Black women who sold chicken at the train depot in Gordonsville, Virginia, in Orange County, Virginia. And I, in talking with other historians, said, well, they were like, well, this kind of thing happens all the time at any whistle stop. It's not that big of a deal. But it is a big deal, I learned, because this was an actual organized effort. Okay, so then to see how organized it was, I then went to the census because these women had recorded chicken vending as their occupation. And many of them were homeowners. Some of them were business owners. One of the women in the interview that I found said, my mother paid for our house with chicken legs. The first one burnt down, and when it did, she rebuilt it. So for me, that is where I got the title of my book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, because that's what I was interested in. What were the phenomenal things that African Americans have done with food as opposed to just simply existing on a postcard in caricature? I knew from my experience as a Black person living in this America that we have done amazing things with food. We've burned mortgages from repeatedly having dinners after every church service. But we've done other things as well. We've created art. We have, created entire films like Soul Food that surround this particular food item. So in that book, I literally take one food object and I pull the thread as far as I can. And of course, there's a lot more information that can be given. There's a lot more interpretation that can be done. But for me, I think I pulled it as much as I could. I went from, for example, at the Library of Virginia, I found legal statutes dating back to the 16th and 17th centuries, which prohibited anyone from trucking and trading, especially Native and Indigenous people, from trucking and trading with the Africans. Well, who would have known? Who would have thought? And I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Some of this information you also get from secondary sources. A lot of the a lot of historian projects I read on enslavement. And while they weren't really interested in food, I would say, this rings a bell. Let me follow up and find out more. So, I absolutely use everything I can. Nothing for me is off limits as a researcher and as a scholar.
I think a point about your commentary that really resonates with me is the idea that the process of historical research is just as much about the questions that one asks and the mode of inquiry you bring to the sources as it is about the sources themselves. Because, as you say, there's not really a shortage of avenues to take when you're doing this kind of work. It's up to the scholar, the researcher, the writer to shape the contours of the project and really find those golden threads that allow you to tell a meaningful story.
It really is, Alex. It really is. It's a matter of you going in and saying, what is the story that I want to tell? And then once you determine what that story is, you get as much information as you can. And from there, you begin to build your narrative, right? And it's not always going to be exactly how you want it to be. And so you tinker with it a little bit, right? And you play around with it. When I submitted my first draft to my advisor, she said, "Oh, this needs a lot of work." Of course, and you should suspect as much. She was like, "Otherwise, we'd all be able, to do a great job and write many books, you know? Um, and so I said, okay. And what was happening, quite frankly, is I had all of these pieces, but they were all over the place. They were in different places in the manuscript, right? And so I said, okay, there's something I'm trying to say, and I can't quite figure out what it is. And I remember going away with my best friend while she was doing some work, and I just sat in a room, and I was like, "What is it I'm trying?" And then I was reading a book by Angela Davis called "Blues Legacies" and Feminism, I believe, or something to that effect. But Blues Legacies, and I was reading her book, and I said, "Ah, that's the narrative." And I think she may have said something like, "The stories of Black women are often, relegated to the margins." I've forgotten now what she said exactly, but whatever it was a light bulb moment. And so what I share with people is that the writing process takes time. Sometimes you're only writing for an hour. Sometimes you're only writing, you only have a paragraph. But for me, the joy of doing this work and digging into the archives is, you may find just one thing, right? And another, but you may find a lot of things, I often share with people the research of another scholar whose work I really admire, and her name is Sawande Mustaqim, and she wrote the book Slavery at Sea. And why I like Professor Mustaqim's work is because she looks at 18th century slave ship manifests and the records that were kept by enslavers and traders and doctors on the 18th century slave ships. And amazing information was kept, right, in these records. I curated an exhibition for the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health on and it's titled Fire and Freedom, and it's available right online. And I found similar records in their holdings and in their archives. Again, they're not necessarily focused on food or African Americans. Their records are from a medical standpoint, and yet going into that particular type of reference, that is a doctor who was aboard a slave ship, I found out all kinds of things about the types of diseases that some Africans experienced during the horrific transatlantic slave trade. I found out things about scurvy and the ways in which many African women aboard these slave ships were brought aboard specifically to, as one as one doctor said, dress the victuals, right? So they were brought aboard specifically to cook the food. And in cooking the food, it wasn't just random food. They were cooking food from their homeland because it was imperative that these enslavers have a well-fed, whole labor force. So now from that one source, you end up getting information about food. You end up finding about disease. You find out about the various brutalities that may have been instituted in order to get African people to eat. You find out lots of different things that could easily have been missed if you did not probe that source. So I find that to be, for me, some of the exciting parts of going into the archives. So when Professor Mustaqim's book came out, Slavery at Sea, and I started just reading more about what was indicated in those manifests and in those enslavers' notes and in those doctors' notes. They do say a bit about the kinds of food that was picked up through trade and barter at various ports. So then we know that slave ships were, of course, refurbished, resustained over time, restocked, and we find out then how food has traveled historically, right? Because a lot of folks are very fond of origin stories. I'm not, because I just think we should just assume that food travels, right? Uh, and has been traveling since people have been traveling, right? But it is fascinating to know when you go back, as far as you want to go, where different foods have come from. And so just finding out the kinds of foods that were brought aboard in slave ships at different ports throughout the world was just really fascinating to me about how these particular types of foods arrived in the Americas and certainly uh, in North America.
Tell us a bit about your newest book project. What inspired you to write it, and what are your key
My
findings?
newest book project actually somewhat hails from my first book project because while I was traveling, I had the good fortune to travel throughout the United States and abroad. I had a lot of different questions about, well, just how do we just get people to eat better and healthier? And those questions were somewhat removed from my project, but actually they were in keeping with what was happening um, throughout the United States at that time. We were in a sort of third wave of counterculturalism, if you will, around food. There was a massive resurgence and has been a massive resurgence around gardening and growing your own food and so forth. And so this began to happen right around 2006, 2007 as I was touring. The other thing that started happening between 2006 and I'd say somewhere around 8 or 9 is a lot of dollar stores started to gain refrigeration. And so you began to see things like bread appear, but also orange juice, eggs, dairy products, bacon, sausage, stuff like. And so I began to question who's buying food from the dollar store? And why aren't we talking about it? And so when my second book came out, I remember I was trying to write an article for that volume on dollar stores, and it just wasn't coming together as I wanted. So again, here's that iterative question again, right? Because this book has actually been in the hopper since about 2006, 2007. It's just got released. So sometimes ideas have to really, really percolate. But this book is about shaming because even while all of those wonderful things were happening in the food realm and in our real time, I also was detecting a very moralistic tone being associated with why can't people eat healthier? What was left unchecked in those questions were, well, whose definition of health are we talking about? And how is it that we are assuming a universal definition of health? Then we had the grow local, right? And buy local. And I started to say, well, yes. And what about people for whom their primary food cultures are outside the local area? Right? So, what about migrants, trans migrants, folks who are from other countries? When we insist that buying local is the best way to eat, we forget that folks want to thrive in their lives, and that for a lot of people, movement can be traumatic, it can be unpleasant, it can also be pleasant. But it does require change. And so if you're coming from somewhere and you cannot get access to any of your traditional food cultures, that can be very disorienting. And so insisting that people eat local without remembering that for a lot of people, fufu or lemongrass or egusi or TZ or goat meat or what are staples, and it speaks to longing and belonging. We lose out on an entire understanding of people different from ourselves. So this book really came about as a result of those experiences. And so I'm telling a number of different stories in this book based on my personal experiences. Quite frankly, yes, anyone can have a number of different reactions and responses and say, well, I didn't read that situation that way. You're absolutely entitled to that. My goal is to open up the conversation beyond simply celebrating food or disdaining food. I want us to have a more robust conversation about what it means when we move about our everyday lives and understand that people make very critical decisions about food all day, every day, eat consciously and unconsciously. And so when we walk into a person's space and we say, you should do X, we are totally disavowing their sense of self and their right to understand what is best for themselves, perhaps at a given moment in time. The research process was somewhat different, but not really. I had been doing this research for many years. I had been to several different archives, but it doesn't have as much of a historical inclination and bend to it as my other writings. But it still does require a great deal of reading in around the secondary sources and journal articles and talking to people and verifying what folks are saying has taken place. So I enjoyed it, although it was once again iterative, and certainly it was very long in coming and somewhat complicated at times.
One of the critical issues of our time is expanding the kinds of stories of the past that we find in collections and bring to public attention. What are strategies that the interdisciplinary field of American Studies uses to turn this goal into a reality?
Well, I'm certainly biased, and I think interdisciplinarity is absolutely the way to go because I think that there's just so much to learn. So, take, for example, at the Rosenbach, I am interested, my next book project is on African American domestic interiors. And it's a project that's near and dear to my heart since I began graduate school and my study of the material world through the study of material culture. And I began my graduate career working at a historic house museum that was owned by a German millionaire in the Washington, D.C. area. And so, as it turned out, the Historical Society of Washington at that time was located in the home of the Heinrich family. And so I would go to work 2 or 3 days a week and be amidst some of the most beautiful interior design, well carved dining tables and dining rooms, and rooms that were filled with very old and um, elaborate wallpapers and so forth and so on. And so I became enamored with the meanings of the domestic interiors, right? And then Elizabeth Cohen's work, historian Elizabeth Cohen's work on working class domestic interiors really fueled a lot of this energy for me. So if in starting this new project, I'm looking at African Americans of all classes. So from Frederick Douglass's home here in DC, which I understand the majority of the furnishings are not even in the home, but they're in storage out in another part of Maryland, because as an elder statesman, he was given so many beautiful pieces. But everyone from him to maybe someone, say, like Phyllis Wheatley, to those who were previously enslaved and then upon Reconstruction and freedom, they adorn their homes in particular ways. But I want to hone in for a moment on Phyllis Wheatley because I know that the Rosenbach has some pieces of her collection, right? First editions of the first book published by her and so forth. So presumably her poetry. But it leads me to want to, for example, say, well, does she talk at all about her domestic life? And if not there, then where, right? Where can I find more information about the domestic life? Now, I may not be able to go to the archives and say domestic life of Phyllis Wheatley. No, instead I would have to look at Phyllis Wheatley's papers. And it could take me a day, a week, a month, a year just to find any mention whatsoever of what it was like for her in her everyday life. What did she eat? What did she drink? Now, we know not every person chronicled their lives in this way, but that's the kind of way that I would approach this new project. So, for example, I take as a starting point a 19th century novel by author Pauline Hopkins, who wrote the book Contending Forces. And Contending Forces was republished as part of the Oxford University Press series of books that were published in the 90s alongside Henry Louis Gates. And they republished a ton of 19th century Black women's fiction and nonfiction. So anyone from Anna Julia Cooper to Hopkins to others in between, Magda, and a book called The Hazley Family by Charles Johnson. So just a number of different by Miss A.E. Johnson, The Hazley Family. And so what I do is I read those particular kinds of narratives, and then I start again to look for patterns. I'm looking for class patterns. I'm looking for regional patterns. I'm looking for other kinds of patterns. What are people buying? One of the things about the Hopkins novel that's so fascinating to me is in the middle of the novel, the author goes to great lengths to talk about a church fair that took place and the prizes that the participants were competing for. And so she says things like a sideboard and a watch. And they're things that we today, of course, would take for granted. But in 19th century African-American culture in New England, among working class and middle class folks, those items were very much prized. So then I want to know more. So I may go to the Phyllis Wheatley papers and say, well, did she, participate in such types of decor and decorum? And then who else can I find? And sometimes you may find someone you weren't looking at or you weren't concerned about at all, and so you find out more. You find out, for example, that certain folks were given collections of items. A wonderful exhibition that took place, for which you can probably still get the exhibition catalog. But it was so very enlightening for me. It was curated by a former historian who's now passed on, by the name of Barbara Carson. And it was at the Octagon Museum here in Washington, D.C. And it was on some of the domestic interiors of the first presidents. And I will never forget that I read one of her placards that said, wealth at that time in the 17th and 18th century was often measured by the number of implements that a family had in their possession. And by implements here, we're talking about housewares, right? And so I just found that to be very fascinating, and it has always stuck with me that if you could afford, numerous forks on the table, butter pats, all kinds of china and so forth, that was an indication in part of your wealth. And I just found it fascinating because it was around food and eating, along with other domestic furnishings. So those are the kinds of things that I am drawn to, and that's the kind of process that I engage. It's very repetitive at times. It's not always rewarding. But when you're doing a topic you love, I think that you can find the reward in that.
You've spent a lot of time at museums, libraries, and other kinds of organizations doing research and sharing your findings. Why, in your opinion, are collecting institutions like the Rosenbach important to our civic life? What role do you think libraries, archives, and museums have to play in civic discourse in a time of growing polarization and distrust?
Yeah, I mean, repositories are life, right? They are living, breathing holders of times past that often are reflective and signal to times present. So much of what is happening in our society today that is deemed polarizing has always been there for, for large swaths of people, namely African American people, indigenous folks, and to some large extent, Asian Americans and Latin Americans as well. It's just the rest of the world is now catching up with it. But we have always, as African American people in America, clearly coming through enslavement, have always felt set apart and put apart and separated from American society as a whole. We've always had to fight to help people to recognize African American history is American history. It's not as if we're separate and apart from, we're a part of. it's only now that and since, of course, the summer of 2020 with the murder of George Floyd, and then, of course, the fact that we were locked in and many of us were glued to our television screens because we didn't have as much movement taking place, that now everybody's sort of eyes wide open, right? Um, but this has always been the case for Black people. And I think that repositories have a very important and necessary task of documenting the past so that when we reach these moments, if we were to go back into these collections, into these beautifully and wonderfully often potent, curated conversations and stories, we would see, oh, we're not that far from what happened 50 years ago. We've just gotten comfortable and forgotten about it. Or something has just happened in society that has re-triggered our need to revisit it. But without these repositories, where this information is kept, where these objects are kept, we would often not remember, both willfully and unwillfully. One of the best exhibitions I had ever experienced, which was curated by Spencer Crew and Bill Yangst, I believe, at the National Museum of American History, was titled From Field to Factory. And it was the story of African American migration from the South to the North. And there were just so many different things that you read about, but you've never seen in person. A KKK, a Ku Klux Klan, a robe, cotton. What is the boll weevil, which was one of the aided in the push factors, right? Along with the racial and state violence, the presence of the boll weevil, which ate up a lot of the cotton crop, and then the lure to the north by industrialization. But one of the most fascinating things that they put in the exhibition, in the middle of the exhibition, were two doors. One was colored and one was white. And people would often obliviously walk through. And then someone would say, "What door did you walk through?" And they were like, "Huh?" And you had to go back and look. And to see the levels of consternation on the faces of people. I don't know. If I go through the white door, and if I'm white and I go through the white door, does it mean I'm racist? If I go through the white door and I'm Black, what does that mean? I mean, just a simple doorway, which caused people to dialogue and be uncomfortable. And I think we need to sit in that discomfort because our histories are not always these placid, serene, beautiful things. They are full and fraught of history, of violence, of brutality, of things that we would like to forget. But those scars remain on the generations of people in America, Black, brown, Asian, what have you. And so we shouldn't be allowed to forget. And repositories, thankfully, don't allow us to forget. I just wish that many more of us would take advantage of them, and appreciate them for their splendor, for the ways in which they can open up your mind to a time that you may not remember, or a time you never lived through, or what have you. But they all in all point to our present, and most often can be indications of our future.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing these fascinating insights. I'm really pleased to have learned more about how primary source materials like those housed at the Rosenbach and so many of our sort of sibling institutions around the country can help historians and the general public understand the past and communicate their findings to the public.
I think so. And thank you so much for having me. I love anytime I'm able to spend in the archive, from those like the Rosenbach to Library of Congress, and even to the one room, historical society space in some of our areas. These are amazing places that if you ever get the chance to just go in and look around, they tell incredible stories. And I think we would all do well to engage them when we can, whether large or small, whether you're doing research or you just want to enjoy learning something new and something about the past that may speak to the future. So thank you for having me and for these wonderful questions that actually took me back for a moment into those spaces that give me some of the most joy.
Well, I'm glad to have been able to spark that sentimental journey, and I very much agree that these, whether they be large and prestigious institutional repositories of collections or small local organizations, these kinds of institutions exist to advance the cause of our republic and of our shared life together in this country. So, the more people who have the opportunity to explore them, the better, I say.
I agree. I agree 100%. And I think, anytime you get the opportunity to contribute to any of these organizations financially or otherwise, that you should take the opportunity to do it, because when we've lost our histories, then I think we've basically lost who we are as a society, and as a collective of people working for common and yet also often different goals.
Thank you for listening to the Rosenbach Podcast. Check back soon for another glimpse into the Rosenbach Museum and Library's remarkable collection of rare books, manuscripts, art, and artifacts, and for more fascinating conversations about history, art, and culture. To learn more about the Rosenbach, visit rosenbach.org. We host a variety of on-site and online events and public programs, and always welcome questions from listeners about how to use our collections. Our holdings are always accessible to researchers who make a free appointment to visit our reading room. The Rosenbach's community reaches all around the globe, brought together by our love for history, rare books, manuscripts, and the arts. I hope you will consider supporting the Rosenbach Museum and Library and this podcast by becoming a member today. It's one of the best ways to help us with projects like this. Memberships start at just $55 and give you access to everything we have to offer, online and in person. If you cannot make a financial contribution, please give our podcast a good rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to help us build our audience. The theme music for Season 2 of the podcast is a setting of the poem Longings, written by poet, artist, and educator Nellie Rathbone Bright in 1927. Bright co-founded the Black Opals, a collective and literary journal showcasing young Black writers in Philadelphia in the late 1920s. The musical version featured here was performed by Yolanda Wisher, Paul Geis, V. Shane Frederick, Mark Anthony Palacio, and Sir Lance Gamble.
I want to flee to a cool
The Rosenbach Podcast is supported by a grant from the Evelyn Toll Family Foundation. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about history on the next episode of the Rosenbach Podcast.
In the heart of me, drums in my ears, and my lips are wet with the tang of the sea.